morning, patrons. Great to be with you again. The next series of talks that I'm going to be doing on this platform are going to be devoted to that great Victorian battle piece, the Battle of Isandlwana, taking place on the 22nd of January 1879, and saw the British Army suffer one of her greatest defeats at the hand of the native army in her entire Victorian era. Now, you might need to cast your minds back a little bit to some of our previous commentaries about the threat of the newly resurrected Zulu army under their King Qunqebe, and the threat that they apparently posed to the British plan of confederation for this country after the discovery of diamonds and gold. And the British began to seek a reason to issue the Zulus with an ultimatum. That reason came in the winter, in July of 1878, where a Zulu chieftain called Sihayo had two of his wives stoned to death on the banks of the Buffalo River, which had from 1843 onwards constituted the border between Natal and Zululand, along with the Qunqebe River off to its southeast. After the stoning of these wives, the British issued the Zulus with an ultimatum in December of 1878, listing a whole litany of demands and concerns that they had regarding the Zulu army. But the most important one for the purposes of our little talk here this morning was that the Zulus disband their army within 30 days, otherwise the British would come and disband it for them. What is ironic about all this is that at the time in 1878, the British were fighting an inconvenient war in Afghanistan, which was not going well. It still isn't. So Westminster and Whitehall said to the officials in Natal not to go to war with the Zulus. The officials in Natal, seeking to go to war on their own account, began to collect colonials, white and black, to bolster their numbers, and more than half the invading force turned out to be Zulu-speaking black people assembled from exile where they were living in the colony of Natal. Barefooted, dressed and equipped as Zulus, armed as Zulus, but given a red bandana to tie around their head to indicate that they were fighting for the British. That bandana was normally worn around the upper left arm. And I want you to imagine, in the summertime of 1878, December, the rains had arrived after 3 years of drought. 5 columns, totaling 15,000 men, would approach the Buffalo and Qunqebe River in preparation for the invasion of Zululand upon the expiry of the ultimatum at midnight on the 10th of January 1879. And I want you to imagine that Irish trader James Rourke, who had passed away in 1875, taking his own life in a fit of alcoholic rage, awaiting a resupply of gin. I wonder what he would have thought. And I wonder what his successor, the Reverend Otto Witt of the Swedish Missionary Society, thought when the Central British column arrived in their front yard at Rorke's Drift. 4,850 men, 4,500 oxen, 500 horses and mules, 220 wagons and carts, 850 tents. It was chaos. And they awaited for the expiry of the ultimatum that they could crack on and invade Zululand, believing that they could subdue the Zulus inside of 3 weeks. It wasn't long before fever set in, enteric, typhoid, and dysentery, which is why Lord Chelmsford, the British commander, had to commandeer the missionaries' home as a hospital and commandeer his church as a store. And more about this later when we talk about the famous Battle of Rorke's Drift. And in due course, this huge conglomeration of humanity, their livestock, their horses, their wagons and their tents, would cross a full Buffalo River on the 11th and 12th of January 1879. On the 12th of January 1879, Lord Chelmsford moved forward towards Isandlwana along the old rudimentary wagon track to the lip of what is called the Bache Valley. Now, the Bache Valley was at the time the home of the Qunqebe people, belonging to that wealthy Zulu chieftain Sihayo, who'd given the British the excuse for the ultimatum by the stoning of his young wives in the Buffalo River. Ironically, Sihayo and his senior warriors had been assembled to Ulundi, Ondini, the high place, the capital, the seat of Qunqebe, after the issuing of the British ultimatum, the Zulu king had assembled his elders and his men to Ulundi, the capital, to try and find a diplomatic means to avoid a war. How ironic. The Zulus did not want a war with the British. And also to celebrate what they call the Mkosi ceremonies, the celebration of the arrival of the rain, like Americans celebrating Thanksgiving. And after 3 years of drought, there was a great cause for joy caused by the arrival of the rain. The arrival of the rain had a number of ancillary advantages. It swelled the Buffalo and the Tugela River, giving the British a natural, convenient boundary between Natal and Zululand. And they knew that it was the Zulu custom to assemble to celebrate the arrival of the rain, which is why Chelmsford and his men were rushing, wanting to congregate on this assembled Zulu mass at Ulundi and defeat them, and also avoid being caught up in Zululand in the winter with no grazing for the cattle and the horses and so forth. And because the Qunqebe people lay on the advance line of the central British column towards Isandlwana and onwards towards Ulundi, Chelmsford thought that he would give them a crack. Firstly, to clear the way forward into Zululand, to test his untested Natal native contingent in battle. And very importantly, if you're afraid that your potential enemy will not stand and fight, it makes sense to give them a bloody nose as soon as you enter their territory. And Lord Chelmsford had some of his senior officers select 800 of the Natal native contingent with some men of the 24th Regiment of Foot to attack into a stronghold. There is a beautiful gorge in the Ngatla Ridge where you're surrounded on 3 sides by a cliff, and the only approach against you is uphill through rocks and boulders into that stronghold. And that is where Sihayo's people retire to in a time of threat. And the young officer chosen to lead this attack against the aged women and children of the Qunqebe people was a young officer called Henry Charles Harford. I hope you remember him. I've spoken about him before, the beetle collector. The man who was interested in beetles and butterflies and birds' eggs and hailed from Herefordshire. And he thought it was a bit steep. He said, I think it's unreasonable to expect me, a mere beetle collector, to lead this jittery bunch of Natal native contingent, who the British called untrained untrainables, embarrassingly, into battle for the first time, into a rather inhospitable piece of country. Well, his senior officer, George Maury Hamilton Brown, patted him on the back and said, oh, Charlie, you'll be fine. I want you to imagine the scene. It was a drizzly, grey, rainy day. The British sent horsemen around from each side to stop Sihayo's people escaping, and Harford led 800 of the NNC down that slope, over the Baiche stream, and up into that stronghold of the Ngatla Ridge. And when they got there, a voice rang out from a cave above, probably learnt to speak English on the diamond fields of Kimberley, where many Zulus had worked as migrant labourers, and had shouted, by whose orders do you come? And Duncan, a fellow officer to Harford, shouted back a patent untruth. He shouts, we come in the name of the Great White Queen. Well, I don't think the Queen knew who Zulus were or where Zululand was. She was about to find out. And a heated skirmish broke out, in the middle of which Charles Harford collapsed in a heap to the ground. And a great shout went up that Harford was down, Harford was dead. And Hamilton Brown rushed forward, afraid of finding this young officer of whom he was very fond dead. Instead, he found him down on his hands and knees, transferring a rare beetle of the Elytridae family into a matchbox. This is what the empire is built of. The beetle was in the box, Harford was alive, the battle could proceed. And it did. 31 of Sihayo's Qunqebe people were killed, including his young son, Qunqebe. Their village was destroyed, the grain pits opened and destroyed, the livestock driven off. And Chelmsford turned to his men, and you see, it's going to be easy. All we have to do is get these people to stand and fight. Now, this incident on the 12th of January 1879 is scarcely mentioned in modern histories about the war. We believe it deserves a chapter of your understanding, because here was the excuse for the issuing of the ultimatum to the British. Here was the first unbridled aggression against the Zulus, against the largely defenceless people in the absence of their chieftain and their senior warriors. Here was an easy victory that infused in them a dangerous complacency with which they will proceed to Isandlwana. And you're going to see how that complacency manifests itself in the establishment of the camp at Isandlwana. And as a little aside here, I want to say this. It has never been our intention to undermine, question or demean the British class system that exists in Britain, more structured then than it is today. But the history books and the class history of Britain would give you the impression that a British officer was a tall, good-looking man of high birth and good education, who probably sat over there around a table with cutlery and silver and so forth, and ate roast beef and Yorkshire pudding. And that his soldier was a tough, grubby little taff who came from the coal pits of southern Wales, who signed up for $1 a day when their coal mines closed and their families died of influenza and typhoid, and that soldier sat over there around a fire eating bully beef and hardtack. I want to tell you that in my reading of this campaign, I find instead a remarkable relationship that existed between this British officer and that British soldier. Those British soldiers largely were illiterate, as were their families. So the families would go to the schoolmaster or the priest in Llantarnam and dictate a letter to their boy on the veldt of South Africa. That letter would in turn arrive in South Africa, and the officer would read it to the boy sitting around the fire until a new letter arrived. And that officer in turn would take the time to write a letter back to the family on behalf of his soldier. Eventually the officers were teaching their men to read and write. I find a great warm relationship, one of respect and affection, that existed between these officers and these men. And I don't believe that the great British Empire could have been built on the premise that there was a great divide between the officers and the soldier class. Indeed, many of these soldiers who died at Isandlwana were of average age 32. Many had been soldiers for 16 years. Do you not think that a fine relationship had developed in all that service time with their officers? I think that these men and these officers would have died for one another. But the main point of the story is the dangerous complacency and confidence that incident against the Qunqebe people infused in the British, with which they proceeded to Isandlwana. And you're going to see how this confidence manifests itself in the establishment of the camp shortly. Thank you very much. Please continue joining this journey with us on Patreon.